So, if you're alive, you've probably heard that the debt and the deficit are controversial. Let's talk about that. And I'm basing much of this on a great article that links to a lot of other great articles from December 1st, 2020, New York Times, Paul Krugman's Biden's Bevy of Deficit Doves. Try to say that 3 times fast. And in it, we are relying on 2 of the most well-known macroeconomists alive today, Olivier Blanchard, formerly of the IMF and president of the American Economic Association, and Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, best-selling author, and current professor and columnist for the New York Times. So it occurs to me that talking about deficit and debt is pretty abstract. We all know that there's some alarm with the size of our debt, but not sure exactly how to think about that. The government obviously needs to borrow. Has it borrowed too much? That's a good question. So let's relate it to student debts and student loans. So many of us borrow to put ourselves through school, and we would say that it is worth it if the payoff pays for the cost, right? Does it pay for itself? And that's the same question I think we can apply to government debt. Are they borrowing the money for a cause that will pay off in the end, right? And this is basically a generic benefit cost problem, right? Does the benefit outweigh the cost? That's a common economic sort of idea. And so what is the cost? The interest rate. What are interest rates like right now? I'll show you in just a second on some data, but they are very low. How about the return on investment? Well, it's going to depend on exactly what you spend it for. If the government's going to buy a bunch of candy bars and let them melt in the desert, that doesn't seem like a very good use of money. It's not going to have any payoff. Whereas if we put it into education or NASA or something else, climate change, all these things probably will pay off, right? Although some of them are harder to measure than others. And the question we really want to ask is, does the program that the government is borrowing money for generate economic growth? So let's look at the data. What are we looking at here? The 10-year Treasury constant maturity rate. This is the cost that the federal government needs to pay people to induce them to lend money, right? So governments finance their deficits through borrowing. And the things that they borrow with, the IOUs that they write to people to loan them the money, are called bonds or bills, depending on how quickly they mature. Some of them are for 3 months. These ones happen to be for 10 years. This is a standard measure of sort of the cost of borrowing. So 10-year government T-bills and T-bonds for the U.S. currently are very low, right? Look at the historical record here. They are currently very low, meaning it's very cheap to borrow for whatever program, especially if we're thinking about education, infrastructure, military, things that are probably likely to generate a lot of benefits. It's very cheap to borrow for these very sort of potent programs. And the question about, is this sort of a recent phenomenon? No. In general, according to Olivier Blanchard, interest rates have been less than economic growth. In other words, it's cheap to borrow for most of the recent past. Now, it's worth noting that not all government programs are equally growth creating. The government can be stupid in the way that it spends its money, or it can be smart and growth generating. You might ask, what about other interest rates? Because the question of crowding out comes up. Crowding out is when the government is borrowing out in public, as it does when it runs deficits, and it's going to crowd out other investment. In other words, it is borrowing from the same pot that your corporate America and entrepreneurs and basically the growth generation private investment is doing. And so if the government comes in and needs to borrow money, that's less money left over for other entities to borrow. This pushes up their interest rate and makes it not worth it, therefore depressing private investment. That's crowding out effect, as a reminder. And that's a debatable thing. That's a highly contentious theory. So let's look at other interest rates, because Olivier Blanchard is going to have something to say about other interest rates. So other interest rates are also fairly low. This is the prime rate from banks. This is the rate that banks charge their best customers for loans. And this is the corporate bond yield, what corporations have to pay to borrow money, much like the governments do. They sort of write IOUs or bonds, and this is what they are paying. AAA is the highest rating, so the safest of the bonds are very, very low. What does this tell us? And last but not least, the 30-year mortgage rate. This is your standard mortgage in the U.S. It's also very low. So there's a lot of causes here. Monetary policy is part of this. But let's bring our attention to Olivier Blanchard again. These low interest rates, he has a different way of thinking about them. They're an indication that the private sector is not super hot on investment. They're not demanding a whole bunch of loans to pay for new expansions. How do we know? Because the price of those loans is very low. So the demand must not be that high, or at least demand relative to supply is not very high. So that the idea of, crowding out, we need to make sure that that private businesses can have low interest rates so that they can do what they want with money, that just doesn't bear out according to Blanchard. And anyway, why do we assume that private, which private only and always means non-governmental, why do we assume that private investment is better and generates more growth and somehow is more robust opportunities than public or government investment? So really, the question is, should we worry that government-public investment depresses economic growth because it decreases private investment? Again, context matters. Simple narratives that say that debt is always bad or debt is always good are hooey. So, what are we thinking about? It depends. If we're in a depression or a recession, government borrowing is not going to crowd out non-existent private investment. Look at the graphs here. Every time you have a recession in the vertical gray bars, you have a period, let's look at the last few, preceded by a drop in private domestic investment. So it's going down. Government action and borrowing during that recession props it back up. Now, should we worry about crowding out in other times, like when the economy is doing really well here in the 90s? Perhaps, but that's not the question of right now. And in fact, these recessions, if not reversed by government fiscal and monetary policy, may actually make for a permanently lower growth. So that's a bigger topic, but the idea of that the government can crowd in private investment by making the economy healthier faster, bringing back good opportunities, is an important one. Whoa, you say, isn't there a point where debt can get to be too much? Well, most mainstream economists would say yes, but again, they would not worry about it during a recession. There are some modern monetary theory people that we'll talk about in another slide that actually think we should worry even less about the debt. But that is a controversial and kind of fun topic if you want to read more on. Okay, so what about World War II? We never paid off that debt. But the economy kept growing faster than the debt, so the debt to GDP ratio fell. This is like that student loan that you took to get you through college, and then it never went away, but your income is rising faster. So your ability to pay off the debt is what matters, and this economy's ability to pay off its debt is clear, right? We have the amount of debt is actually rising, but the debt as a percent of the size of the economy, as divided by the gross domestic product, is dropping. And here's a longer term view, more years showing. The deficit is at the top. That's the yearly shortfall. And you can see that we go into deficit during those vertical gray bars or the recessions. And that's fiscal policy for you. We also sometimes, a lot of the times, actually run deficits even when we're not in recession, right? Notice the Reagan run up here. First time we started running sort of large deficits even during economic growth. you have in the 90s, Bill Clinton in his second term did actually run a surplus, the only one in recent history. And then we have another recession, plus the Bush tax cuts push us into deficit again, and the Great Recession and the Obama stimulus put us into even bigger deficits, and then the Trump tax cut here before the coronavirus hit was sending us into a pretty large deficit. And how that relates to the debt, as you know, is the deficit is the yearly shortfall in the government budget. So if they spend more than they receive in taxes, they are running a deficit. Those deficits add up, and we're borrowing ever more money every time we run a new deficit. And so when deficits rise, that correlates directly with debt rising. And this is all as a percent of GDP here on the bottom graph. For the last main point, I want to return to that question about, are we assuming, or should we assume, that private investment is somehow more fruitful than public investment? And Krugman makes this point and brings out this graph that public construction, that's government spending on infrastructure for the most part, as a percent of gross domestic product, is actually at fairly historical lows. You did have the Obama stimulus here, but and this is all the years we have. But in the years that we have data for, the most recent few years, the most recent decade really, has been pretty stagnant infrastructure spending, meaning that our infrastructure is getting older and not being replaced, and is, when you see the bridges collapse, for instance, you go, oh my gosh, we should be spending more on upkeeping our infrastructure. And this, although it's hard to measure the benefits, we know the benefits to the economy of a sound infrastructure are huge. And this is all optional, but if you're interested in modern monetary theory, these advocates are what are known as heterodox, not orthodox economists, but they're getting a lot of play, and they tend to not worry so much about the debt. Here are the tenets, and you can look at the Wikipedia page for more. But basically, the first 4 points, they agree with orthodox economics pretty much. It's the fifth point that is in disagreement, and that is that crowding out is not an issue. We are not in competition. The public sector and the private sector are not in competition for investment, and there's a whole lot more about the uses of money in society, but I'll leave it to you to decide if you want to look more.